Summer is upon us. Do you want to stay cool and dry at night? Try bamboo sheets from CozyEarth.com. Not only do you get a good night's sleep and stay cool and dry, but also you get to save 21% off just by using our code at checkout. InfoGo. And they have a 100-night sleep trial, so it's a win-win. If you don't like them, send them back, but I promise you'll fall in love with them. And while you're over there, check out their socks. They have a whole line of apparel. And that's CozyEarth.com. Use our code InfoGo at checkout to save 21% off. Hey, this is going to be me butchering all kind of words of ayahuasca.
Ayahuasca.
Exactly. Sorry. Give me a minute. Welcome to the podcast. I'm William,
And I'm Kat,
and that makes this Info on the Go.
feeding your curiosity with every show. So, we open far back in time, not with modern ceremonies, but with an idea. Long before written records, deep in the Amazon basin, human groups are already learning the forest, not just surviving it, but decoding it. Among tens of thousands of plants, they find something unusual. A vine that is not powerful on its own, but becomes something else when combined with another plant. No science, no terminology, just observation, repetition, and time. And a medicine is born before it is understood.
Hmm. Okay. So before ayahuasca is ever a brew or a ritual or even has a name, it exists inside a much older story, the human shaping of the Amazon, right? So
Right.
for a long time, the Amazon was described in Western accounts as a kind of untouched Eden, if you will, a vast, wild rainforest where small, scattered groups of people survived lightly on the edges of nature. And that picture is now largely outdated because archaeology, soil science, and mapping satellite mapping over the last few decades it has revealed something very different. The Amazon is not simply a natural wilderness. In many regions, it is a human-shaped landscape built and managed over thousands of years.
And one of the most important discoveries supporting this terra preta or Amazonian dark earth, these are extremely fertile black soils found in patches across the basin, especially in Brazil. Unlike the naturally nutrient poor soils of the rainforest, terra preta contains charcoal, bone, pottery fragments, and organic waste. It was not formed by accident. It is widely understood by archaeologists to be the result of long term indigenous soil management, likely involving controlled burning, composting, and intentional enrichment of the land. Some of these soils are estimated to be hundreds of to thousands of years old, and they remain fertile today, long after their creation.
Hmm. This alone changes the timeline of the Amazon, right? Because it suggests sustained, deliberate land emerging from indigenous societies across vast areas, not just small, isolated pockets of habitation. And archaeological surveys using LiDAR technology, which is basically laser mapping that can see through dense forest canopy, have added even more evidence in regions such as the Zangyu.
Zangyu River
Yeah,
Basin,
yeah, I'm pretty sure that's Zangyu.
same.
Okay. Researchers have identified geographic earthworks, road networks, causeways, and settlement patterns indicating organized societies with large populations. These were not temporary camps, they were structured landscapes built and maintained over generations.
Alongside this physical evidence is a broader understanding of forest management systems. Ethnobotanical research shows that many so called wild forests in the Amazon are actually anthropogenic in composition, meaning human influenced. Indigenous groups historically practiced what modern researchers sometimes call forest gardening, encouraging the growth of useful species, transplanting plants, protecting certain trees, and shaping biodiversity patterns intentionally.
Studies of present day and historical indigenous practice show that Amazonian people, well, they managed a wide range of plant species that they use for all kind of things. Cacao, Brazil nuts, rubber, and a numerous fruit-bearing trees, often increasing their abundance far beyond what would occur without human intervention. And in this sense, the rainforest is not just a backdrop to human life, it is practically a co-created ecosystem.
This long history of environmental management is inseparable from knowledge systems that developed over thousands of years. In the absence of written language in many regions, knowledge was preserved through oral tradition, ritual practice, apprenticeship, and direct ecological observation. Plant knowledge, in particular, was highly structured. Healers, shamans, or plant specialists learned not only which plants had effects, but how they interacted, how they were prepared, and in what ceremonial or seasonal context they were used.
And this matters because ayahuasca does not emerge from random experimentation. It emerges from a broader indigenous scientific tradition of deep botanical literacy, where thousands of plants were organized by effect, toxicity, synergy, and purpose. Medical, spiritual, or all of the above. And the combination that produces ayahuasca itself reflects this kind of long-term empirical knowledge. Two plants that on their own do not produce the same effect, but together create a sustained psychoactive experience due to, well, pharmacology interaction.
Within this context, Amazonian societies should not be understood as isolated groups simply living in nature. They were and are participants in complex ecological systems that they actively maintained, modified, and interpreted. Their landscapes were not untouched, they were historically cultivated environments embedded with cultural memory, which leads to a key shift in perspective. The Amazon is not just geography, it's an archive.
And every layer of soil, every modified forest composition, every managed grove, every surviving oral tradition carries evidence of long-term human presence and intention. Even without written records, history is still present. It is stored in landforms, ecological patterns, and living cultural practices that continue into the present. So, when we later talk about ayahuasca, it is not the beginning of the story. It is a product of this much older world, one where knowledge, environment, and human life were not separate categories, but part of the same continuous system.
Now, the origin of ayahuasca does not sit neatly in a single moment of discovery. Not a laboratory breakthrough or or recorded invention. It emerges instead from something far older and harder to trace. Generations of accumulated ecological knowledge inside the Amazon basin, built slowly through observation, experimentation, and cultural transmission. At the center of this system is the vine Banisteriopsis caapi, a woody liana found throughout the western Amazon. By itself, the vine is not strongly psychoactive, but importance is not obvious at a first glance. But within indigenous knowledge systems, plants are rarely understood in isolation. Their effects are interpreted through relationships, what they do when combined with other species, how they behave in preparation, and how they interact with the human body. And spirit is understood within local cosmologies.
So, somewhere within this long history of experimentation and ritual use, a critical discovery was made. Banisteriopsis caapi is combined with certain other plants, most commonly leaves containing DMT, such as Psychotria viridis. In many other regions, the result is something entirely different from, well, either component alone. So, from a modern pharmacology perspective, this works because the vine contains hormonal alkaloids, which act as a MAO inhibitor. And these compounds allow DMT, which would otherwise be broken down during digestion, to become orally active. But this explanation comes far later. The historical reality is that indigenous practitioners, well, they did not begin with chemistry. They began with effects, pattern, and, well, lived experiences.
This is where ayahuasca becomes historically significant. It represents empirical ethnobotany before formal science existed as a discipline. Over countless generations, Amazonian peoples built a working understanding of plant interactions through careful observation, testing combinations, refining preparation methods, and passing down knowledge through apprenticeship, oral instruction, and ritual practice. This was not random experimentation. It was structured, cumulative, and deeply contextual.
So, as knowledge of these plant interactions developed, so too did ritual frameworks surrounding their use. Ayahuasca was not simply consumed as a substance, it was embedded within structured ceremonial settings. These settings often included dietary preparation, periods of absence, periods of abstinence, or restriction. And they were done in controlled environments designed to, well, shape the experience. So the brew became part of a broader system of relationship between humans, plants, and the unseen world as well as it was understood by the Amazonians.
Within this context, specialized roles began to emerge, what outsiders would later describe as shamans. These were not simply users of plant medicine, but experts in ecological and spiritual knowledge systems. Their training often involved long periods of isolation, dietary discipline, and guided learning under experienced practitioners. They learned which plants interacted safely or dangerously, how to prepare brews with consistent effects, and how to interpret these experiences that followed ingestion.
So, crucially, their role expanded beyond healing in a narrow sense. So, they functioned as go betweens between human communities and the broader ecological and spiritual environment, using plant knowledge as a tool for diagnosis, communication, and restoration of balance. In many traditions, the plants, well, they were not passive materials, but active participants. Sometimes they were described as teachers or intelligence within, well, the forest system. I love that.
Me too. It is important to understand that ayahuasca did not exist as an isolated invention. It is part of a much wider Amazonian pharmacopoeia that includes hundreds of medicinal and psychoactive plants used in different combinations for different purposes: physical healing, hunting preparation, divination, protection, and social cohesion. The brew that later became known globally as ayahuasca is one expression within this larger system of botanical intelligence.
So, from a historical perspective, what emerges is not a single discovery event, but a long process of, well, cultural communicating and the science behind what they learned from each other. Knowledge was not written down in text, but it was encoded in ritual practices, oral traditions, songs, and it was embodied. Apprenticeships, accuracy was not preserved through publication, but through repetition, correction, and well, lived experiences because I believe if you mess this up, you're gonna remember not to do that again, right?
Right. But in this sense, ayahuasca represents something more structurally complex than a drug or even a medicine in modern categories. It's the product of indigenous science systems, systems grounded in observation, experimentation, ecological relationship, and intergenerational transmission of knowledge without written language. And so, when viewed in its proper historical context, the question shifts. It's no longer simply, what is ayahuasca? But rather, what kind of knowledge system had to exist for something like this to be discovered, refined, and preserved for thousands of years?
So to understand ayahuasca historically, it is not enough to understand how it is made. You also have to understand how reality itself is structured within the Amazonian worldviews that gave it meaning. In many indigenous Amazonian cosmologies, reality is not a single flat layer of physical existence. It is often understood as multiple, interconnected layers of being, where humans exist alongside animals, plants, ancestral forest, spiritual intelligence, and these layers are not always separate domains. Instead, they are frequently described as overlapping worlds that can be accessed, influenced, or perceived under certain conditions. Rituals, dreams, illnesses, or plant medicine ceremonies.
Within this framework, what Western categories separate into nature, religion, and psychology, are often treated as one continuous system of reality. The forest is not just a physical environment, it's also a relational, symbolic, and communicative. In this context, shamans, often referred to by different local names across regions, are not simply healers in a biomedical sense. They're understood as mediators between visible and invisible realms. Their role is to navigate interactions between human communities and non human forces, animals, ancestral beings, plant intelligences, and what many traditions describe as spirit entities embedded within the forest itself.
So their authority is not based on abstract theory, but on training experience and perceived mastery of altered states of perception. Through ritual use of plants like ayahuasca, fasting, isolation, and long apprenticeships, they learn to interpret visions, bodily sensations, dreams, and environmental signs as meaningful information. In this worldview, illness is rarely seen as purely, well, mechanical or biological. Instead, it is often understood as a disruption of balance between individuals, their community, their environment, and the broader spiritual ecology they inhabit.
Healing, therefore, is not simply about removing symptoms, it's about restoring equilibrium within a system of relationships, as having social, emotional, spiritual, or ecological dimensions. The goal of healing is to realign those dimensions, not just suppress a visible outcome.
One of the most important tools in this process is the ayakar, a type of ritual song used during ceremonies. Ayakars are not merely music in the modern sense. They function as a layered system of communication, describing what's going on, but they also serve multiple roles at once. They guide the participants through altered states, calling on directing plants, spirits, stabilizing the ceremonial space, and transmitting knowledge that is difficult to express in ordinary language.
In many traditions, ayakars are learned through direct experience in altered states and through long apprenticeship. They are often considered received rather than composed, meaning shamans describe them as being taught by the plants themselves, by ancestors, or by non ordinary perception within the ceremony. Whether interpreted literally or symbolically, they function as a combined oral, musical, and experiential knowledge system.
So, within this view, the forest itself is not passive. It is often understood as, well, being a communication system where plants, animals, weather, spirits, they all have a dynamic relationship within the human perception and action. Certain trees, vines, or locations may be seen as holding, well, direct knowledge or influence. Animals may be interpreted as messengers or indicators. Even illness or environmental change can, well, it can be read as part of the broader communication network.
From a Western analytical perspective, this can sometimes be mischaracterized as purely symbolic or metaphorical. But within indigenous frameworks, these relationships are often treated as real and operative within their system of understanding reality, not as abstract representations. This is where a major historical contrast becomes important. In much of Western intellectual history, knowledge systems have been increasingly separated into distinct categories. Medicine becomes biological and clinical. Religion becomes spiritual or theological, and ecology becomes environmental science.
But each is studied, practiced, and validated in different institutional frameworks, right? Because in many Amazonian systems, however, these categories, well, they're not clearly divided. Healing, spirituality, ecological knowledge, and social balance are, well, they're often part of the same integrated worldview. A plant may be, well, it may be used for medicine, a teacher, and also a rational being. Ceremony may be therapeutic, spiritual, or it may have ecological meaning.
Understanding this difference is essential to interpreting ayahuasca historically. Without it, the practice can be reduced to chemistry or psychology alone, stripping away the cultural structure that gives it coherence. In its original context, ayahuasca is not just a substance that produces an experience, it is a part of a knowledge system embedded in a living relationship with the forest. where perception, environment, and meaning are not separated but continuously interacting parts of the same reality.
I gotta get a Coke after this. Let's take a break.
Same. I have to fetch a Pepsi.
No, Coke.
Pepsi.
We're gonna fight about this during the break. You know that, right? We'll be right
Yes.
back.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
I came across Big Fork Brands recently, and it's become one of those finds you actually want to tell people about, and you don't find that often. Okay. They're doing bacon sausage, plus these really solid pork jerky snacks and Chicago style sauces. Basically, upgrade anything you throw them on burgers, hot dogs, fries, throw it on there. It works.
But I bet it's packed full of junk.
Actually, it's made with clean ingredients and real care. That's small batch with no shortcuts, and people are obsessed with the flavor. You can go over to bigforkbrands.com, use our code INFOGO at checkout, and get 20% off anything on the site.
You can find the link and our code in the show notes. So now that we're back, I won. Cat is no longer with us. For thousands of years, indigenous knowledge systems in the Amazon evolved within their own ecological, continuity. It was shaped by river systems, migration, oral tradition, ceremonial practice, and direct relationship with the forest itself. But that continuity was not permanent. Beginning in the early 16th century, it encountered a new historical force that, it would reshape the Americas on a massive scale. And we're talking about European empires.
Spanish and Portuguese expansion into South America introduced systems far larger than isolated exploration or regional conflict. These were imperial structures tied to global trade, territorial control, religious conversion, and extraction economies. The Amazon, once distant from European power centers, was gradually pulled into a growing colonial world.
Early missionaries, explorers, and colonial officials entering the Amazonian regions, they frequently encountered indigenous ceremonial practices. And these practices will sometimes involved psychoactive or visionary plants. Their written descriptions were often fragmented or filtered through, the European assumption, right? And they would often use terms like witchcraft, diabolical rites, superstition, hallucinogenic, you know, and it really appeared regularly in the colonial accounts.
Ayahuasca itself was not consistently identified by name in early European writings, but practices related to visionary brews and ritual healing were repeatedly observed, even if poorly understood. Historically, what matters is not only what Europeans saw, but how they interpreted what they saw.
Yeah, because the indigenous ceremonial systems were rarely approached as coherent bodies of knowledge in their own right. They were viewed through missionary frameworks that were really trying to conform these people into what they believed. Altered states of consciousness were often interpreted as evidence of paganism, spiritual deception, and demonic influence rather than, a part of their structured indigenous cosmologies.
This produced not only misunderstanding, but pressure. Colonial expansion carried consequences far beyond religion alone. Disease spread rapidly through indigenous populations with no immunity to Eurasian illnesses such as smallpox, influenza, and measles. So, entire communities were weakened or erased within generations. Population collapse fractured social systems that had preserved ecological and ceremonial knowledge for centuries. Just broken.
Gone. And at the same time, colonial labor systems, it displaced communities from traditional territories. Mission settlements reorganized social life around, the Christian institutions. Ceremonies were, they were discouraged, suppressed, or pushed further into remote areas. In some regions, indigenous practices blended with Christian symbolism, producing centric traditions that adapted while preserving underlying structures. And yet, despite enormous disruption, indigenous knowledge systems, they did not disappear.
One reason was geography itself. The Amazon is immense. Dense river networks, difficult terrain, seasonal flooding, and ecological complexity created vast areas where colonial control remained incomplete. Many communities continue living in remote regions beyond sustained direct oversight. And in these spaces, knowledge survived through oral transmission, apprenticeship, ritual practice, and ecological continuity. Ayahuasca traditions adapted to changing conditions without fully losing their foundations.
This is important historically because ayahuasca was never one single unified tradition. Knowledge moved between communities through trade routes, uh, marriages, migration, shared river systems. Different groups developed different ceremonial structures, plant combinations, interpretations, and ritual meanings. What would later become broadly labeled as ayahuasca tradition is actually a constellation of related practices spread across multiple languages and cultures throughout the Amazon basin. So basically, there's not one single place. It's kind of like skull cults. They have the same thing, but it means something totally different, right?
Right.
Okay.
The result of this colonial period is therefore not a simple story of destruction or survival alone. It is both at the same time. Some traditions disappeared, others fragmented, others adapted and continued under pressure. This historical reality is one of resilience existing alongside catastrophic loss. And underneath that history lies a deeper question. What survives when an entire worldview is pressured by empire?
Oh, wow. In the case of ayahuasca, what survives is not nearly a psychoactive brew or a ceremonial ritual. What survives is a relationship-based system of knowledge connecting people, plants, memory, healing, land, and meaning itself. That continuity endured because communities continued practicing it, transmitting it, and adapting it, even as the world around them was starting to change dramatically.
And from that fractured but persistent continuity, ayahuasca eventually re enters the modern historical record, not as a rediscovered artifact, but as a living tradition that never fully disappeared. By the late 19th century, the Amazon entered another transformation, this time driven not primarily by religion, but by industrial capitalism. Surprise.
Yeah, and far from the rainforest, factories expanded across Europe and North America. Electrical systems spread into cities. Bicycles became, well, they were popular, right? Automobiles, they began to emerge. And all of it really depended on something that came from, well, the rainforest, rubber. And the Amazon basin contained the world's richest natural supply of latex producing rubber trees. And global demand, well, it was on the rise. It exploded almost overnight.
What followed became known as the Amazon rubber boom, a period stretching from the late 1800s into the early 20th century when vast sections of the rainforest were reorganized around extraction economies tied directly to international markets. The forest was no longer only spiritually mapped, now it was economically mapped. River systems that had long functioned as indigenous transportation and trade networks became industrial extraction corridors. Traders, labor recruiters, missionaries, soldiers, entrepreneurs, and fortune seekers moved deeper into Amazonian territory than many outsiders ever had before.
And for indigenous communities, the consequences were often devastating. I know we're going to do a whole episode on this. We're just going to kind of break it down real quick. The rubber extraction, well, it destroyed a lot of the rainforest, right? It brought about wars. It brought about mass death that were tied directly to rubber production networks. Entire communities were destroyed. But even with all of this going on in the background, knowledge that once remained largely within indigenous ceremonial systems increasingly, well, began to encounter outsiders, missionaries, laborers, all these people that were coming in for this rubber extraction and all the things that Kat talked about. They started to interact with, well, ayahuasca. So these river systems that had long functioned as indigenous transportation routes, well, they were taken over by all these people that were coming into the rainforest now. And for the indigenous community, well, the consequences were often devastating.
But alongside exploitation came another historical shift. Knowledge that had once remained largely within indigenous ceremonial systems increasingly encountered outsiders and came in contact with ritual plant practices they often did not understand, including ayahuasca ceremonies. And in some communities, ceremonial knowledge remained carefully protected. In others, fragments began spreading outward through observation, trade, written reports, and intercultural contact.
And this did not suddenly make ayahuasca globally famous, right? But the isolation surrounding many Amazonian knowledge systems had begun to weaken. The rubber boom becomes historically important for two reasons. One, it intensified colonial violence and disruption across the Amazon, and it accelerated the movement of information between worlds that had, well, previously remained more separate. And the same river systems that were carrying this rubber outward into global markets will also carry those stories, rumors, scientific curiosity, and culturally encounter back in the other direction. And from that point forward, the Amazon could no longer remain invisible to the industrial world.
By the 19th century, the Amazon was no longer only a space of oral tradition and internal knowledge transmission. It had also become a site of European scientific curiosity, extraction, and classification. Surprise. Botanical expeditions, imperial mapping projects, and early anthropological fieldwork began to push into regions that had previously been documented only in fragments or colonial reports.
These expeditions were not focused on ayahuasca directly at first. They were broader attempts to catalog the Amazon's biodiversity, its plants, medicines, potential the potential to make money, right? The resources that were there where they could make some money from this. And botanists and naturalists, well, they collected specimens, pressed plants, recorded local names when possible, and attempted to fit Amazonian ecological knowledge into European scientific classification systems.
It is within this context that ayahuasca related practices begin to appear more clearly in written records. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, ethnographers, missionaries, and traveling scientists began documenting accounts of ritual use of visionary plant brews among various indigenous groups in the western Amazon. These accounts, however, were often inconsistent. The same practices might be described differently depending on the observer, the translator, or the cultural assumptions being brought into the field.
So, one of the earliest challenges was language itself. The word ayahuasca comes from Quechua, and it's often translated as vine of the dead or vine of the soul, which is where we got the name for this episode. But it was not the only term used. Across the Amazon basin, similar preparations were known under different names, including yage in parts of Colombia and other regional terms depending on the language, the group, the cultural text. What later becomes categorized under a single umbrella for Western literature, in reality, it really had a diverse set of related practices embedded in different indigenous cultures.
As these practices entered written records, they were also filtered through the conceptual frameworks of the observers. Early ethnographic and missionary descriptions frequently interpreted indigenous ceremonial use of psychoactive plants through European categories that did not clearly align with Amazonian worldviews. As a result, ayahuasca related practices were often labeled in ways such as intoxicants, hallucinogens, primitive rituals, shamanic superstition. Now, these labels reveal more about the worldview of the observers rather than the internal logic of the practices themselves.
In many cases, indigenous frameworks where healing, ecology, spirituality, and knowledge were integrated were either simplified greatly or just erased entirely. What was a structured system of ritual knowledge? Well, it could be reduced in description to, well, altered state or drug induced vision. The richness of context, preparation, song, apprenticeship, ethics, and ecological knowledge, well, that was lost or really just compromised in translation.
At the same time, academic anthropology was beginning to formalize as a discipline. Field researchers started to live for extended periods among indigenous communities, documenting languages, rituals, and medicinal practices with increasing detail. Some of these records became foundational ethnographies of Amazonian life. preserving valuable information about plant knowledge systems that might otherwise have remained undocumented in written form. However, even as documentation improved, a deeper issue really remained. Translation is never neutral.
To record ayahuasca in writing is not simply to preserve it, it is also to transform it into something that can exist within different epistological system, one based on classification, taxidermy, and textual reference. In this process, meaning is often reshaped. What was once experienced as rational and embedded in lived ritual becomes something that can be described, compared, or analyzed as an object to study. In other words, to put that quite frankly, we don't understand what the shamans are actually doing, so we're just gonna tell you what we think they're doing.
Right. Now, this is the central shift of this historical moment. Ayahuasca moves from being primarily lived knowledge within indigenous systems to being documented knowledge within external academic systems that is open for so much interpretation. And in that moment, something fundamental changes. Once written down, it becomes translated. And once translated, it becomes subject to reinterpretation by science, policy, medicine, and eventually by global culture.
Basically, we don't understand it. We're gonna categorize it, we're gonna filter it, and
Demonize it.
reframe it as something through the lens of the Western world and not through the Amazonian indigenous tribes that were using it.
Essentially, we're not going to take into account what their belief systems are or how they actually used it.
This brings about the scientific turn because the 20th century, ayahuasca had already existed for generations within indigenous Amazonian knowledge systems. It had survived colonial disruption, remained active within their ceremonial traditions, and gradually appeared in anthropological and ethnographic writing under a variety of names and interpretation. What changes now is not the existence of the practice itself, but the lens in which it is seen.
For centuries, outsiders primarily described ayahuasca through observation. Stories of rituals, visions, healing ceremonies, and unfamiliar spiritual systems. But during the 20th century, Western science increasingly shifted from describing ayahuasca culturally to analyzing it chemically. The brew moved from ceremony into laboratory.
Researchers studying the plant eventually identified two major biological components, right, that were really responsible for ayahuasca's effect. The first was DMT, dimethyltryptamine, and this is a naturally occurring psychoactive compound found in several plant species and are known for producing intense altered states of consciousness under certain conditions.
The second was a group of compounds called harmala alkaloids, found primarily in the Banistrophis caapi vine. These compounds function as monoamine oxidase inhibitors, or MAOIs. From a pharmacological perspective, this interaction proved critical. DMT on its own is normally broken down rapidly in the human digestive system before it can become psychoactively effective when swallowed. But the harmala alkaloids inhibit that metabolic process, allowing the DMT to remain active long enough to enter systemic circulation and affect the brain. In other words, ayahuasca's effects do not come from a single ingredient alone. They emerge from a biochemical relationship between multiple plants.
This discovery marked a major turning point in how ayahuasca was understood outside the Amazon. The brew was no longer discussed only through anthropology or ethnography. It became an object of pharmacology, neuroscience, psychiatry, and neurochemistry. Something once understood primarily as ritual knowledge could now be measured, isolated, categorized, and theoretically produced beyond, well, the original cultural setting.
At the same time, scientific interest in psychedelics expanded more broadly during the mid 20th century. Researchers studied substances like LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, and DMT as part of larger efforts to understand consciousness, perception, cognition, and the biological foundations of subjective experience. Questions once considered philosophical or spiritual increasingly entered laboratories. What creates the sense of self?
How does the brain construct reality?
What happens neurologically during altered states of consciousness?
Could psychedelic compounds have psychiatric or therapeutic value?
But while science moved deeper into exploration, governments moved toward regulation.
The government moved into regulation, pharmaceutical companies moved into making some money, right?
Indeed.
Okay. By the second half of the 20th century, expanding international drug control systems will increasingly classified psychoactive compounds under controlled substance laws. DMT, one of ayahuasca's active compounds, became heavily regulated and, well, prohibited in many countries. And this created a tension that still exists today.
Modern legal systems often categorize substances according to chemical composition and perceived risk profiles. Indigenous ceremonial systems, however, understand ayahuasca through entirely different frameworks: spiritual continuity, healing practice, ritual structure, and cultural relationship. Those two systems don't always align.
No. In some countries, there are exemptions that have merged for ceremonial or religious use. In other words, ayahuasca remained restricted regardless of cultural context. The result became a fragmented international landscape where ayahuasca existed simultaneously as a sacred ceremonial tradition, a controlled chemical substance, and, well, subject of scientific research. Despite legal controversy, scientific interest, well, it continued growing into the late 20th and early 21st centuries.
Neuroscientists studied how psychedelic compounds affect perception and neural connectivity. Psychologists explored their relationship to memory, trauma, and emotional processing. Psychiatrists investigated possible therapeutic applications for conditions such as depression, addiction, anxiety, and PTSD. The research remained cautious, heavily debated, and still evolving, but the broader shift was unmistakable. Altered states of consciousness had re entered serious scientific discussion after decades of marginalization.
And yet, within this modern framing, an important historical perspective can easily disappear. Science arrives late to something that already has a history. By the time ayahuasca entered laboratories, clinical studies, and brain imaging research, it had already existed for centuries, perhaps millennia, within indigenous systems of ecological knowledge, ceremonial practice, and cultural transmission. The scientific lens does not erase that history, it just kind of overlays on it. Science has new questions, new models, and new forms of understanding, but it does not begin with the story of ayahuasca.
By the early 20th first by the early 21st century, ayahuasca entered yet another phase of transformation: global demand. What had once remained primarily within localized ceremonial systems of the Amazon now attracted international attention on an unprecedented scale. Academic research expanded, documentaries introduced global audiences to Amazonian plant medicine traditions, and internet forums spread personal accounts worldwide. Retreat centers appeared across parts of Peru, Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica, and beyond. A new kind of traveler began entering the Amazon. Not for rubber, not for conquest, and not for missionary work.
But for experience itself. For many outsiders, ayahuasca became associated with ideas such as spiritual awakening, psychological healing, trauma recovery, emotional insight, self discovery, or just escape from the modern alienation. And from that demand, an entirely new economy emerged: ayahuasca tourism.
Retreat centers expanded rapidly. Ceremonies became marketable experiences. Global wellness culture increasingly absorbed Amazonian plant medicine into broader conversations about therapy, spirituality, consciousness, and alternative healing. But globalization also introduced major tensions. One of the central questions became authenticity. Who has the authority to lead ceremonies? Which traditions are being preserved and which are being reshaped for international audiences?
Yeah, in some cases, experienced indigenous healers and long-time trained ceremonial practitioners, well, they became respected figures within a growing international interest. In other cases, Inexperienced facilitators, self-proclaimed shamans, and poorly regulated retreat operations, well, they kind of emerged alongside the rising demand of ayahuasca. Concerns about the exploitation really kind of started to emerge about safety, responsibility. What was once considered a cultural ceremony is now really just being exploited for tourism.
And at the same time, environmental pressures really increased. Growing international demand for ayahuasca ingredients intensified harvesting in some regions, raising concerns not only about cultural extraction, but ecological sustainability itself. What happens when a sacred ecological relationship becomes part of a global market? That question sits near the center of the modern ayahuasca era. Kind of reminds me of the Lorax.
Oh, that was good. I like that. I like that. I would agree. Hey, we got something over here. Everybody's interested in it. Let's exploit it and let's just drain the resource until it's gone and we can't have any more of it, right?
Hmm.
By this point in history, ayahuasca exists simultaneously in multiple worlds at once. Indigenous ceremony, scientific research subject, legal controversy, spiritual sacrament, therapeutic possibility, wellness industry, and as an international tourism economy because the people want to get the brew that the ancients had. But the world surrounding it, well, it's changed completely.
By this point, ayahuasca has moved through many different historical frames: anthropology, religion, chemistry, medicine, law, and globalization. And yet, none of them fully contain it on their own. What begins to emerge is not a simple timeline of isolated events, but a layered continuum shaped over thousands of years by observation, tradition, disruption, survival, and reinterpretation.
And across the deep history of the Amazon, indigenous communities will develop systems of botanical knowledge through close and sustained engagement with one of the most biological complex environments on the planet. Knowledge of plants were they were not written in textbooks or laboratories. It was carried through memory, apprenticeship, ritual practice, and oral tradition. Certain plants became embedded within systems of healing, cosmology, and social meaning that, well, connected human experience directly to the forest around them.
Then came colonial disruption, disease displacement, missionary pressure, and cultural suppression. Entire knowledge systems were fractured. Some practices disappeared, others adapted, but ayahuasca traditions survived, even as the world around them changed. In the modern era, those same practices were reinterpreted through entirely different frameworks. Chemistry identified active compounds, neuroscience studied altered states of consciousness, pharmacology analyzed biochemical mechanisms, governments attempted regulation, global interest transformed ayahuasca from a regional ceremonial practice into an international subject of research, tourism, spirituality, and controversy.
Yeah, ayahuasca. I mean, I guess it's generated a cult following, maybe.
I guess you could say a cult following. You don't want to try it? You don't want
Uh,
to mess with your consciousness?
no, I do not want to mess with my consciousness. I like to be conscious. But
Fair.
I mean, I guess I'm not knocking anybody's thing. I am not. I think if you're going for a spiritual awakening and you're dealing with a legitimate shaman that has historical, the historic,
Experience.
yeah, there you go. Thank you for what I was looking for. I think if you're going for that and you wanna get into, the world around you, go for it. But if you're just going for a trip, nah, stay away from it.
Right. That's true too. I would definitely say you would have to be in the right mindset for it. It's definitely not something you just jump into.
But I would agree with you. You would have to definitely be in a mindset for it for sure. That's pretty much all I had. I thought this was interesting. Did you put this on the shopping list?
I probably did.
I love the fact that it's called the Vine of Souls after being translated, or the Vine of Death, whichever one you want.
Right. Same. I guess it depends on the translation, huh?
Yeah. The Amazonian rainforest,
Yeah.
ayahuasca.
Now, if you would like to support this podcast, tell a friend and help get the word out.
If you would like to help support the show, you can do so at Patreon or take advantage of some of our sponsors. All you got to do is use InfoGo at checkout.
William and I want to thank you for listening.
Whether you've been with us from day one or just tuning in, thank you.
You can join the Facebook group at Info on the Go
Over there, you can get to know us.
or ask us a question.
But whatever you're doing, make sure you hit that follow button wherever you're listening to this podcast.
Send us some fan mail using the link in the show notes or leave a review.
Absolutely. Leaving that review really does help others find us, but if you want to email Kat or myself directly, you can do so at
infoonthegopodcast@gmail.com.
and you can find all of this in the show notes. Till next time.
Stay curious.
If your stomach's been off lately, like bloating, reflux, or just not feeling right, there's a simpler way to get back on track.
With Professor B's Digestive Aid, which is an all-natural blend of pure honey and ancient apitherapy, a herb rooted in Roman tradition. You know how at least they had some things right? It's designed to gently support and balance your digestion.
No long ingredient list, no harsh additives, just two powerful, time-tested ingredients working together. It's even the same formula used to help cancer patients manage digestive discomfort.
And right now, you can get an exclusive 10% off any product. Just use our code INFOGO at checkout.